Usually when Eevee is brought up, its evolutions are the first topic of choice. But over the years, Eevee has amassed an army of fans. I think it's because unlike more traditional starters, which are type loyalists that will defend their favorites with 3-paragraph essays on how you are wrong. With Eevee, it's slightly different because regardless of what your favorite evolution is, it all makes us Eevee fans in some form or another. Often you have to take care and train your Eevee before it evolves. Seeing it can evoke some of the same feelings we get when we look at pictures of our pets when they were puppies and kittens. They grow up so fast. Eevee has been very popular since Gen 1 because it's a very special Pokemon. In Red and Blue and Yellow, you only get one per playthrough, and it's the only species that can evolve into multiple different types. So it can fill out some weaknesses that your party might have at the midpoint of the game. However, it might take some of our younger fans by surprise to know that Eevee's popularity has not always been as big as it is now. Pikachu has always had the crown for the Pokemon mascot, and few Pokemon have ever come close. In the late 90s, Eevee actually wasn't even a super big part of their marketing campaign. While Eevee was a part of the core set of Pokemon that found themselves on merchandise alongside Poliwhirl, Gengar, and Meowth, most of the solo merchandise was dedicated to the starters and other Pokemon that were regularly featured on the anime. While every aspect of Pokemon was a huge juggernaut in its respective market, the anime was a huge part of why it became as popular as it did. And so the bulk of kids' favorite Pokemon were of course ones that were owned by the cast, Ash, Misty, and Brock at the time, and of course Team Rocket, whose Meowth got a fair amount of merch itself. However, there was one Pokemon that came pretty close to mascot status back in the 90s, and that was Jigglypuff. While it's a relatively unassuming Pokemon nowadays, Jigglypuff was one of the most beloved Pokemon in Gen 1's heyday. It becomes a reoccurring character all the way into Gen 2 and made cameos throughout Gen 3 in some of the movies. There's even a song dedicated to Jigglypuff called Lullaby in the second Pokemon music album that came out around the time Johto started. You can even see remnants of Jigglypuff's popularity in Super Smash Bros. As Jigglypuff was the only other Pokemon besides Pikachu to be playable in that game, and has been playable in every version of Smash Bros. To date, which not every character can say. To compare, there was only one episode that featured Eevee in the first season of the anime. However, there was one clue that they were catching on to Eevee's popularity, and that is with Pokemon Yellow. In the original games, your rival would pick a Pokemon that had a type advantage over your starter. In Yellow, things worked a little differently. Blue will always have an Eevee as his starter. Depending on the outcome of the first two battles, Blue will evolve his Eevee in accordance. It was meant to be a soft difficulty mode because Pokemon Yellow was meant to appeal more to the anime fans, going so far as to even give you the other 3 starters just like Ash gets in the first season, as well as including Jessie, James, and Meowth. These players may not have been as familiar with the game, so there was a way to keep things challenging for players who were returning to the series while making your rival's Pokemon easier to deal with throughout the game. So when exactly did Eevee become the powerhouse of a pseudo-mascot that it is today? The answer isn't as simple as you might think. Instead, it looks like a steady increase over the years with one big exception, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. One big trend I noticed was an uptick in popularity every single time a new evolution is added. This goes especially for Gen 2. It does help that their designs are absolutely peak. The concept fits so well with the pair using the day and night cycle to evolve. The anime eventually mimics the games, giving Ash's main rival Gary and Eevee during the Johto saga. This was the first of multiple instances of a recurring character owning an Eevee, including May in Gen 3, Serena in Gen 6, Lana in Gen 7, and Chloe in Pokemon Journeys. Gary's Eevee eventually evolves into an Umbreon, but of course, he was only featured in a few episodes. The Neo card sets did give a lot of love to the evolutions this time, including 2 sets with Umbreon and Espeon cards, as well as the original trio's inclusion as light Pokemon in Neo Revelations, giving their Gen 1 dark versions a counterpart. Despite debuting in Gen 2, Umbreon and Espeon's biggest role was still on the horizon. Pokemon Coliseum was the first 3D game to have a story mode and a world to explore. It was meant to be a very edgy take on Pokemon in a time when popularity was waning due to the fans growing out of the Pokemon series, and instead focusing on hot new franchises that were directly challenging Pokemon's market share. So Pokemon Coliseum was their attempt to mature the franchise and keep was left of their audience that was quickly growing into teenagers. Wes is 17 and is a lot older than a usual Pokemon protagonist. In fact, he isn't even a beginner Pokemon trainer. He starts out with an Umbreon and Espeon, meaning he's already equipped with 2 fully evolved Pokemon by the time you start using him. And they start out at level 26. Wes himself was also introduced as an edgy character who rides a motorcycle and is breaking and entering when we first meet him. He steals a Snaggle machine, which allows him to snatch other trainers' Pokemon. While the game did have compatibility with Ruby and Sapphire, unlike Stadium, it was first and foremost advertised as its own thing. So for new upcoming Pokemon fans who didn't play the handheld games, and their first Pokemon were Umbreon and Espeon. So while the question of whether or not Colosseum was enough to keep Pokemon fans engaged was up in the air at that point, Eevee was still building the blocks to its meteoric rise later on. Again, the TCG seemed much further ahead on understanding the popularity of evolutions, making them regularly stars of expansions, featuring them in some of the rarest cards to obtain, such as the Gold Star line featuring every evolution up to that point. Gen 4 is where things truly started to blow up with the introduction of 2 new evolutions, Leafeon and Glaceon. This is where Eevee began to sneak into the top 10 rankings in the most searched Pokemon. With more evolutions, more players were hunting on how to get them to evolve into the evolutions that they wanted. Not only that, but the introduction of yet more Eevees only fueled speculation about more being added to each new generation, even up to the current day. From here, Eevee started receiving more merch, more love from the anime, and even received yet another evolution in Gen 6 to even greater reception than Gen 4. At this point, Eevee was already in 3rd place in collective Google searches, but it was not even a mainline game that sent Eevee into the stratosphere. As far as popularity and name recognition, second only to the likes of Pikachu and Charizard. Pokemon Go hit the fandom in a way nothing else has since the original game. While it was of course a very exciting release for Pokemon fans, something I don't think anyone had anticipated ended up happening. It brought back fans who had grown up with Pokemon, and because it was of the mobile phone nature of the release, they were able to attract people who otherwise were not interested in Pokemon or video games. One of Pokemon Go's biggest reason for success was slowly releasing Pokemon over time, so most of the older fans from the series would be able to identify all the Pokemon in the game when it first came out. There was one Pokemon that stood out in particular because of a little Easter egg. Since there were no evolution stones in Go, there was a more novel way to guarantee your Eevee evolved into the right evolution. If you named them a specific nickname, you would get that specific evolution. Because of this, Eevee's search results blew past Mew, another Pokemon that had a lot of searches due to its very existence being an Easter egg. Because of Pokemon Go's success, it's no surprise that the developers got right to work on finding a way to convert them to console Pokemon gamers. While Pokemon has always had great sale numbers for their mainline game, the Pokemon Company had a chance few properties of its size had. A huge new audience that was ready to engage with its brand. Often, however, mobile game players are not as familiar with using a controller. Enter Pokemon Let's Go, a halfway point between a traditional Pokemon game and Pokemon Go's gameplay. One big difference was that you were tied to a starter depending on which game you bought. So if you got Let's Go Pikachu, you got Pikachu. The alternative was of course Eevee, and I believe the reason it was is because it was the only other Pokemon that could stand up to Pikachu in terms of popularity. The most interesting part about Let's Go was that, like Yellow, you were actively discouraged from evolving your first Pokemon. To make up for this, Eevee did learn special moves, as well as being part of cutscenes. This, I believe, was one of the first times Eevee was able to stand out without its very desirable evolutions being the core reason to obtain one. Since then, Eevee very often has been featured alongside its evolutionary counterparts, and while it's not evolved, it's become a favorite Pokemon of the Eevee line for a lot of players. A very happy ending for Eevee indeed. Alright, TeaLeaves, tell me what your favorite evolution is in the comments, along with your most favorite memory. Mine's Umbreon. I remember being so excited to get one in Pokemon Silver, and I scheduled out my day just to make sure I didn't miss my chance to get its hair styled. He was a tough Eevee too. He used Sand Attack to take down Jasmine and Steelix once all my other Pokemon had fainted. Poetically, it evolved shortly after I got my last gym badge. I remember loving the affection system so much because it was really the first time I'd played a game where you got any reinforcement for actually caring for something. Well, with the exception of Pokemon Yellow and Hey You Pikachu, but that's a story for another day.